Hi guys, so let's go over the answers to the chapter 1 assignment. The first question just asked you to give an example of another bright line accounting rule. You'll notice that when I made my announcement with the FAQs, I gave you a couple more examples of bright line accounting rules. So one would be the consolidation standard that would say, hey, if you own over 50% of a company, you should consolidate. That over under 50% is very clear, so it's considered bright line because it's very black and white, right? You either own more than 50% or you don't. Whether you own over or under 50 is going to determine the accounting treatment that you use, right? If I consolidate, if I don't consolidate. Similarly, in the Lehman Brothers example, it was the value of collateral relative to the loan received, and depending on what percent of the value it was, if it was over 102, it gets accounted for as a sale. If it's under 102, it gets accounted for as a loan. So this over, again, the over under 102, it's very clear you either are or you aren't, and that determines your accounting treatment. And another common example is the old lease standard. So if you recall, the old lease standard, I just pulled this up, had these rules about how to classify a lease as operating versus capital. And you had to think about things like, are you greater than or equal to 75% of the useful life? Is the present value of all the lease payments going to be greater than 90% of the fair value of the property? So with this rule, and this is the old rule, right? The 75% and the 90% were considered bright lines. And you'll notice in the new leasing standard, it says the bright lines related to the 75% and the 90% were removed. Now, why did that happen? Why? And same with the consolidation standard, right? It used to be simple, over under 50% ownership. Now it's this sort of concept of control that determines if you should consolidate something. So these old rules that included the bright line were very typical of historical US GAAP. And over actually the last couple of decades, US GAAP has been moving from more rules-based to more principles-based. This is part of the convergence with IFRS. And so you'll notice in the second question, when I asked you to summarize the difference between rules-based versus principles-based accounting, many of you said in this answer that US GAAP is an example of rules-based and IFRS is an example of principles-based. And that is true, but due to kind of the efforts towards convergence, US GAAP is definitely becoming more principles-based over time as we get rid of a lot of these old bright lines and transition towards more principles-based. And in terms of the last question, what's harder for the auditor, rules-based or principles-based? Well, I'd say each is difficult in its own way. There's really no one black and white bright line answer for this question. So the thing that makes rules-based systems difficult is you have companies that structure transactions around the outcome they want. In other words, I want to make sure that this company is kept off balance sheet. I'm going to make sure I'm under 50% ownership. If I want to make sure this lease is operating versus capital, I can make sure I'm making or failing these 75%, 90% requirements. You could say this makes the auditing easy because really what you're auditing is, did they follow the rule or not? And these companies are following the rule. However, they're kind of following the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law in some cases because they're deliberately structuring the transactions to get the accounting outcome they want. So it's not really about, should I really be thinking about this as a capital or operating lease, right? Am I basically owning this property or not? And similarly, this is what can make the principles-based system difficult to audit. The company isn't following these bright line rules, so it's not as easy to determine if they've met the rule or not. But of course, we see companies like can and do still manipulate these principles-based standards. So I would say both are honestly difficult to audit in their own ways. Historically, the part of the reason we're moving away from rules-based and towards principles-based is because principles-based is supposed to be easier to follow. So it's this whole thing of, do you follow the letter of the law? Following letter of the law would be more rules-based, versus are you following the spirit of the law, which would be more principles-based. So it would be great if everyone followed the spirit of the law, but sometimes people can manipulate that too. Again, I'd say there's no perfect right or wrong answer here. It's more just about opinion and did you make a good argument.